Welcome back, Notre Dame fans, to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. This is going to be a special edition, quicker podcast, and we're going to talk about the top 25 coaches in college football. And the reason that's relevant today is because The Athletic released their annual top 25 list of college coaches. You have one list from Stuart Mandel and one list from Bruce Feldman. In this list, Brian Kelly was ranked as the number 3 head coach in the country by both coaches. Now, Mandel had Brian Kelly ranked 3rd last year, so it shouldn't be a surprise that after leading Notre Dame to a college football playoff that he stayed at number 3. Bruce Feldman had Brian Kelly ranked 8th last year, so to see him jump up all the way to number 3 after a 10-2 season was surprising. So let's dive into first Brian Kelly and where Brian Kelly should rank and why I rank Brian Kelly where I rank him. And then we'll dive into some other thoughts that I have from this list, because I have some strong opinions, not just about where Brian Kelly ranks, but also about where some other coaches rank. So let's get right to it. So to begin, let's talk about where Kelly is ranked in this list. Obviously, Nick Saban is number 1. Dabo Swinney is number 2. That's clear. That's obvious. I don't know anyone that would have it any different. I think the only case you could make, if we're going to talk more recent history, is that you could maybe make a case for Dabo being over Coach Saban at number 1, based on head-to-head, the fact that they have the same number of titles. I think in the last 5 years, Alabama won a title in 17, and in 2020, Clemson won in 16 and 18. But I think when you look at it bigger picture, and based on the writings of both of these authors, they do try to take the entire scope of a coach's work into consideration. But I think we should put more emphasis on what has been done in the last 4 or 5 years, because if you're not, then Mack Brown needs to be way higher on this list, because Mack Brown is one of just a handful of coaches that has a national championship under his belt. So for me, I'm going to focus really on the last 4 or 5 years and talk about rankings. Now, I don't think having Brian Kelly 3rd is an absurd ranking. I'm not upset about it. I'm not, oh, this is crazy. I just think I wouldn't have him there. I would have him at 5. And the reason for that is I think that when you look at Brian Kelly's resume, a lot of his best work was in the last 4 or 5 seasons and then before Notre Dame. Yes, there's the 2012 season, but when you look at Brian Kelly's first 6 years, that was really an aberration. The last 4 years is really when we've seen Brian Kelly take this program to much greater heights, and it's been successful. 43-8 the last 4 years, 2 bursts to the college football playoff, 2 top 10 finishes. He absolutely deserves to be in the top 5. A couple years ago, I probably wouldn't have had Coach Kelly in the top 5, but I think there does come a level of consistency where, I've pushed back and I've said, hey, look, the 11-2 from 2019 was not good enough, because you only beat one ranked team all year. That was Navy. You got embarrassed by Michigan. It wasn't a great year, but it was 11-2. That's the standard that Brian Kelly has taken Notre Dame to, where you should be able to look at an 11-2 season where Notre Dame beat one ranked team and say, this isn't good enough, because the program has gotten that good. 11-2 with one win over a ranked team before Brian Kelly arrived would have been a cause for celebration at Notre Dame. So I think that's where Brian Kelly, to me, has cemented himself in the top 5. Is Notre Dame has developed a level of consistency the last 4 years where, even though they haven't been spectacular, they haven't been really competitive against the better teams on the schedule outside of a game against Clemson, which to me needs some conversation to add context. But beyond that consistency is important for me. I value consistency over that one great year, which is why I would rank Brian Kelly ahead of Ed Orgeron, for example. I don't think national championship should trump all else. I think national championship should be a strong part of the conversation. But when you look at Ed Orgeron, for example, you see he had that championship year, but in other years before and after that, LSU's kind of been disappointing. He had that one magical season. But I think consistency is where I draw the line, and that's why I think Brian Kelly absolutely has cemented himself as a top 5 coach. I don't think there should really be any debate about whether or not Brian Kelly's a top 5 coach. Where I think there's conversation is where in the top 5 does he fall, and I think this is where there can be some debate, and I think there can be some disagreement here, and I'm going to put him 5th, and here's the reasons for that, and then I'll kind of say why I can understand why people would disagree with me on this. Number 1, I think Lincoln Riley has to be above Brian Kelly. And when you just look at especially recent history, I mean, Lincoln Riley's only been at Oklahoma for 4 years, but We talk about how he's taken, Notre Dame to greater heights. Well, Lincoln Riley's also developed a level of consistency. Now, Oklahoma was a pretty good program when he arrived. They had been to the college football playoff before Lincoln Riley became the head coach. Obviously, they made the playoff in 2015 with Bob Stoops still as the head coach. But in his 4 years, Oklahoma's been to the playoff 3 times in those 4 years. This past season, they went 9-2 in a conference-only schedule, stomped Florida in a bowl game, and had a good season with a lot of turnover. So that is to me, a positive season. The 3 years before that, with 3 different quarterbacks, he went to the college football playoff each time. He's had 2 Heisman Trophy winners. His record of 45-8 is 2 games better than Brian Kelly's record of 43-8. I'm going to get into top record versus top 25 later, which is another reason why I would have Lincoln Riley over Brian Kelly. So I would have him over Brian Kelly. I also think Lincoln Riley has some big wins that Brian Kelly is lacking. Again, the Clemson win was big, but we have to be willing to have an honest conversation about that it was not the same Clemson team that it would have been with Trevor Lawrence and those missing players. That doesn't mean it wasn't a big win. It was a huge win, but I don't view it as big of a win as Oklahoma beating Ohio State at Ohio State in 2017, which was his first season, Lincoln Riley's first season as the head coach. That, to me, was a huge, huge win. And then, of course, they beat Florida this year in a bowl game. So they've got their fair share of big wins as well. And I would say the record versus top 25, which I'll get into, goes into it. And number 4, I think this is the one that can be – I don't think there's much debate that Lincoln Riley should be ahead of Brian Kelly at this point in time. I would also argue that, yes, the 2019 playoff defeat at the hands of LSU was bad, but LSU did that to just about everybody. And also the first 2 playoff appearances that they had were much more competitive. Lincoln Riley's first playoff team in 2017, they took Georgia to overtime. And then even though Alabama controlled the game 2 years ago in 2018, that was a 45-34 game, much more competitive than what we've seen from Notre Dame, who lost 30-3 and then 31-14 in a game where Notre Dame scored last to make it 31-14. It was never a competitive game. It was over by the end of the first quarter. That wasn't the case when Oklahoma played Alabama a couple years ago in 2018. So that's why I put Lincoln Riley ahead of Notre Dame. Number 5 or number 4, I think there can be some debate because I do think longevity is important. And I'm always nervous about anointing coaches that have a shorter track record, because otherwise we would have been talking about Larry Coker being, the best coach in college football after 2 years in Miami. I think he'd already won a title by then. But this to me is different. And that my number 4 is Ryan Day of Ohio State. And I absolutely put it to you like this. I would debate you if you want to debate that Brian Kelly should be ahead of Lincoln Riley. I would debate that with you. I would push back against that notion. I would not really do that with Ryan Day because I think I can understand all the objections that people will make. He's been at Ohio State 2 years. He had the 3 games that he took over in 2018 when Urban Meyer suspended. I don't really count those. I don't think. I mean, it wasn't his team. It wasn't his team in the offseason. It was still Urban Meyer's team. They didn't play any. I mean, TCU was the only good team they played that year in those 3 games, and they weren't even that good that year. But the last 2 years, when I look at what Ohio State has done, I think they've played a competitive schedule. They've been very successful against that schedule. He has a college football playoff victory. You talk about Notre Dame beating Clemson in an impressive fashion. Yeah, hey, that Notre Dame win over Clemson was big, right? It was a huge win. But look what Ohio State did to Clemson in the college football playoff with Trevor Lawrence. They beat Clemson 49-28. I mean, they blasted Clemson this year in the playoffs. So that to me, okay, right there, they've got a bigger win. They played Clemson in the playoff the year before, and it came down to the wire. Clemson picked Justin Fields off in the end zone late in the game. If that doesn't happen, Clemson's or Ohio State's in position to win that game. So they've been much more competitive in those big moments. They've absolutely dominated Michigan. They've beat Penn State twice. They've had big wins. Has 2 Big Ten championship victories. The one in 2019 was far more impressive than the one this year when they beat Northwestern. And it was a shortened season. And I think that's something that could also, you could say, hurt his resume. But when you look at what he's done, they destroy people. I mean, they're really not even close in the Big Ten. I love what he does on offense. I love that he's made adjustments on defense. the Greg Schiano experiment really wasn't working for Ohio State. So he made that change, brought in Jeff Hafley, took a defense that was poor. Jeff Hafley, sorry, brought in a defense that was poor in 2018, quickly turned it around in 2019. And this year, their defense took another step back. And again, he's making moves. He's not content. He recruits at an extremely high level. I think that's another reason that I'd put him over Brian Kelly is he is a grinder on the recruiting trail. I've talked to the people that I have covering recruiting for Irish Breakdown, and they constantly tell me every time they talk to a kid and he mentions Ohio State, he mentions his relationship with Ryan Day. It is amazing that a guy like that could have a head coach at Ohio State could have relationships with that many players. It is something to be admired. So when you combine the fact that 2 Big Ten titles, one, obviously the huge playoff win this year, played for a championship, been in the playoff twice. So he's already equaled Brian Kelly's playoff total, and he's already won more playoff games than Brian Kelly. And his record against top 25 teams in 2 years is significantly better than Brian Kelly's in 4 years. So I think those are the reasons I would rank Ryan Day ahead. But I also am sympathetic to the pushback that I'm going to hear, I'm sure, from people about he's been head coach 2 years and he inherited a great program. Both true. And I get that. And that's probably why I wouldn't debate you on it. I wouldn't. This is my ranking. It is what it is. But if someone were to say, no, Brian Kelly should be ahead of Ryan Day, I'm not going to say you're necessarily wrong. I'm not going to argue with it. I don't agree. But I think there's a lot of merit to the fact that Brian Kelly has been doing this so much longer, and the fact that we need to see Ryan Day sustain this for a few more years beyond the team he inherited from Urban Meyer. Once Larry Coker got 4 or 5 years away from the Butch Davis era, you started to see his issues as a coach come to fruition. He wasn't as good of a recruiter. He couldn't control the program. There's a lot of things he wasn't good at, and we started to see that come to fruition the further he got away from the Urban Meyer, from the Butch Davis tenure. Will that happen with Ryan Day? We don't know. But I think there does need to be a debate about should he be a little bit further along. And honestly, if he had a more expansive track record, I'd probably put him third ahead of Lincoln Riley. Because like I said, what he's done the last 2 years has been really, really outstanding. So that's where I would have those guys. And what I found interesting was Feldman's ranking more so than Mandel's. Mandel had Lincoln Riley 4th and Ryan Day 5th. Again, we had the same top 5. We just ordered it a little bit differently. Other than, like I said, the Lincoln Riley one, there's not a whole lot of debate there. I think he had Kirby Smart too high. I think he has Jimbo. It's a very SEC dominant list. I mean, he's got Nick Saban, Kirby Smart, Jimbo Fisher, Ed Orgeron, Dan Mullen, all in the top 10. Dan Mullen deserves to be there. I guess if you want to look at the fact that Ed Orgeron has a title, he deserves to be there. I feel like Jimbo Fisher is still living off of his Florida State tenure. I do not understand the hype that he gets. And he had James Franklin down at 17. I was happy to see that. He had him below Bill Clark at UAB, below Kyle Whittingham, below Jeff Monken. I thought that was interesting. I thought Pat Fitzgerald was a little bit too high. But I definitely appreciated the fact that he did not overhype James Franklin like Bruce Feldman did. And that's where I have an issue. So Bruce Feldman has Brian Kelly 3rd, Lincoln Riley 4th. Again, I've made that point clear. He has Ryan Day 8th. Here's who he has ahead of Ryan Day. James Franklin at number 5 and Jimbo Fisher at Texas A&M. I do not understand this. And he brought up like Vanderbilt and all these other kind of things. Let's forget the fact that he left the scandals behind at Vanderbilt and focus on what he's done at Penn State. Everybody keeps talking about like he inherited this probation-ridden team. And I'm like, they went 15-9 the 2 years before he got there. They had a winning record both years under Bill O'Brien. Bill O'Brien is who got Penn State through that rough scandal period. And then James Franklin inherited a pretty good program with good recruits, and he was able to build on it. But to me, to have James Franklin and Jimbo Fisher there makes no sense. No sense at all. And if you want to focus on championships, and why not have Ed Orgeron over Jimbo Fisher? That did not make a lot of sense to me. Now, he did have Kirby Smart 10th. And that, to me, is a good placement for Kirby Smart. I think Kirby Smart's one of the 3 best recruiting coaches in the country. He does it his way, and it's let's just leave it at that. We won't get into that because I don't want to tick off the Georgia fans who think they have a clean program. But he's a great recruiter, just an above-average coach is the way I look at it. But But here's the one that got me. He has first of all, there's one lower. He has Gary Patterson ahead of Dan Mullen, which I find laughable. But anyway, he has James Franklin 5th and Jimbo Fisher 6th. This is Bruce Feldman. That to me is just nutty. Absolutely nutty. I want to show you from the last 4 seasons. I'm going to show you these teams' records against opponents that finish in the top 25. Now, here's why I focus on finishing and not what a team was ranked at the beginning, because far too many teams rack up big wins in September over ranked opponents or top 10 opponents. And then by the end of the year, those teams aren't even ranked, or they're ranked like 23rd, because you are based on your ranking in September by and large is going to be based off your preseason ranking. Most teams don't play a lot of tough teams. For example, in 2012, Notre Dame played a top 10 Michigan State team. Michigan State finished 7-6 that year. Did Notre Dame really beat a top 10 opponent? 2015, they beat number, I think, 14 Georgia Tech. Maybe they were 13th. Georgia Tech finished 3-9 that year. I think they'd beaten Tulane and Alcorn State in the first 2 games. Did we really know what kind of team Georgia Tech had? Did Notre Dame really beat the number 14 or 13 team in the country? Stanford a couple years ago was ranked 7th when Notre Dame beat them. They finished unranked at the end of the year with 4 losses. So I like to focus on what a team was at the end of the year, because then you really know the full quality of the team that you beat. And so let's look at this. This is the record of Lincoln Riley, Kirby Smart, Brian Kelly, Ryan Day, James Franklin, and Jimbo Fisher against top 25 teams the last 4 seasons. Now, this right here is why I rank Lincoln Riley ahead of Brian Kelly. This, to me, is a much more impressive top 25. Now, Brian Kelly has a couple wins over Navy, but Lincoln Riley also has a win over Army, who finished ranked in a year that they beat Army in overtime. So, to me, that balances out. Obviously, Lincoln Riley, more success against top 25 teams. Brian Kelly, less success. Kirby Smart at 11-8 is slightly ahead of Brian Kelly, but you could make a case that Kirby could be ahead of Kelly for 2 reasons. Number one, overall record's about the same, almost identical. I think he's like 43-9, something like that. And the other thing, in last 4 seasons, and then also he has a better record against top 25 teams, and he also has 2 head-to-head wins over Brian Kelly. So I would understand a Georgia fan wanting to push back on that. What I would contend, however, is that he's actually, in my opinion, wasted a lot of talent at Georgia. When you consider that they recruit the number 1, 2, or 3 recruiting class every year, Georgia shouldn't be having the losses that they have. They shouldn't be getting beat by Alabama every time they play. I mean, you could say about Notre Dame, well, hey, look, they don't have the athletes that these other teams do. You can't say that about Georgia. And so I actually think Georgia underachieves when you consider the talent they have. Brian Kelly's there at 8. You see Ryan Day is impressive, 8-2 in 2 years. He has almost as many top 25 wins in 2 years as Brian Kelly has in 4. But then let's look at James Franklin right here. James Franklin and Jimbo Fisher here at the bottom of this list. James Franklin is 6-10. Now, Bruce Feldman completely dismissed the fact that Penn State went 4-5 this year. That's fine. He also kind of dismissed Notre Dame's 4-8 year from 2016. But even if you take this year's record out, they're 6-6 in the 3 previous seasons against top 25 teams. That's not impressive to me. They beat Ohio State back in 2016, and he talks about how, hey, look, they have, Penn State has a, when they beat Ohio State back in 2016, Penn State won the Big Ten title that year. Yes, they also lost to Pitt, and they also lost to Michigan 49-10 that year. And then, of course, they went into the bowl game against USC and lost. So I'm not impressed with James Franklin. Yeah, he did some good things at Vanderbilt, but he inherited a pretty good situation at Penn State. He's in the Big Ten in an era where I think the Big Ten is down. And then now as the Big Ten starts getting a little bit better, James Franklin's had 2 of his worst years, in my opinion, in the last 3. 2019 was good. They went 11-2, but lost to Ohio State, lost to Minnesota. Their 2 wins over ranked opponents were Michigan and Iowa. Decent wins, ugly wins. 2018, they were 9-4 and finished, I believe, I'd have to check. I think that they finished unranked, but they might have finished ranked because Penn State always gets a little bit overhyped. And then this past year, they went 4-5. So I just don't understand why there's this. Okay, I guess the year they went 9-4, they finished 17th, even though they lost to Kentucky in a bowl game. Could you imagine? Okay, so here's what happened in 2017 or 2018 when they finished 17th in the country. They lost to Ohio State. They lost to Michigan State at home. Okay, Now, that's a Michigan State team that year that went 7-6. They lost to Michigan State at home. They lost at Michigan 42-7, and they lost to Kentucky in a bowl game. Their only win over a ranked opponent that year was a home win over Iowa by 6. Could you imagine Notre Dame fans losing their minds with that kind of resume from Brian Kelly? I mean, to have James Franklin fifth when in the last 3 years he's gone 9-4 with that resume right there, a bowl loss to Kentucky, and then you have in 2020 they went 4-5. All their wins were over unranked teams. They lost to 3 ranked. I'm sorry, he'd be 6-7 if you take out the last year. He was 0-3 this past season against ranked opponents. Lost to Indiana, lost to Ohio State, lost to Iowa, lost to Maryland and Nebraska. I say, well, it was a COVID year. It's a COVID year for those teams too. So I just don't understand the hype about James Franklin. And Jimbo Fisher, to me, is another one. Like, I think the reason I'm less fired up about Jimbo Fisher is because he does have a national title. I mean, he did win a national title in 2013. He did make the college football playoff, something James Franklin has never done. He did that in 2014, had a regular season, undefeated regular season that year. Obviously had an epic win over Notre Dame. This year they went 9-1, which is fine. But here's what Jimbo has done his last 5 years as head coach. Went 9-1 this year, right? Had a very good win over Florida, then got blasted by Alabama. 8-5 the year before, 9-4 the year before that, 5-6 in his last year at Florida State, and then 10-3 and 10-3. So not since 2016 has Jimbo Fisher won double figures in a season. So I just look at that and I'm like, how do you have him as the 6th best coach in college football? If you want to talk about, hey, look, let's talk about national titles. Well, look, Ed Orgeron's got a better overall record the last 4 or 5 years, and he has a national title much sooner than Jimbo Fisher does. And I wouldn't rank Ed Orgeron that high either. So to me, I think a head coach should be based on, are you maximizing the potential of your program? And when you look at Pat Fitzgerald, that's why he gets some of the hype he does. I think he's a tad overrated, but I think he's a very good coach and does a very good job there. I think for me, that's why I argued for years that David Shaw was a top 5 coach. I backed off that now because I don't think Coach Shaw has done a very good job the last 3-4 years. But from 2011 to about 2017, there weren't 5 better coaches in the country than David Shaw when you consider maximizing the potential of that program. And that's why guys like Lance Leopold are getting ranked in these lists and things like that. And that's why guys like Kirby Smart don't rank as high for me. It's why a guy like Ed Orgeron doesn't rank as high as for me. I mean, if you're the head coach at LSU, you should be a top 5 team just about every year. I mean, the talent you can recruit to that program is absurd. Same thing with Ohio State. I mean, that's just a program that should be dominating. If you can't dominate there, then you're not a good coach. So when I look at Texas A&M, to me, Texas A&M should be ranked higher or doing better than what they've done. Yes, he inherited a program that wasn't real good, but it's not like Texas A&M was garbage, and it's not like he inherited a terrible situation from Kevin Sumlin. Kevin Sumlin recruited well and had some good teams. I mean, they won at least 8-9 games every year before Jimbo took over. So it's not like he inherited, what Charlie Weiss left Brian Kelly. So I just look at Jimbo Fisher, and I just can't figure out why he continues to get that kind of hype. I mean, if we're going to look at the whole resume and take that into consideration, where's Mack Brown on this list? I'm looking at Bruce Feldman's list. He doesn't have Mack Brown anywhere on there. He's just missed the cut. Stuart Mandel has Tom Allen ahead of Mack Brown. He has Hugh Flippin' Freeze ahead of Mack Brown. No Mack Brown on his list either. So if we're going to take the entire resume into consideration, then why aren't we talking about Mack Brown? So what Jimbo Fisher did at another school that he's not currently at anymore doesn't matter as much to me as what he's doing recently and what he's doing at Texas A&M. And what he's done at Texas A&M in no way, shape, form, or fashion should have him ranked as the 6th best coach in college football. And I think that top 25 record right there says it all. And that's with a couple top 25 wins this year. So could that change in a couple years? Sure, he could continue to win. They're recruiting pretty well. I think Mike Elko is a tremendous defensive coordinator, but he's got to do it first. He's living off a reputation, and these rankings should not be, in my opinion, based off reputation. They should be based on what are you doing right now? And what he's doing right now, to me, Jimbo Fisher's not a top 10 coach. So that's kind of my thoughts on that. So Brian Kelly, I have him 5th. Stuart Mandel, Bruce Feldman have him 3rd. Let me know in the comment section where you would put Brian Kelly and why. State your case, right? I stated my case on why I'd have him fifth, why I'd be okay with him being fourth, but why I don't think he should be third. So if you're going to disagree with that, that's totally fine. I like that, but state your case. Let me know why in the comment section. If you're listening in a podcast form, obviously there isn't a comment section. So hit me up on Twitter, find the YouTube channel, shoot me an email if you want to have a back and forth about it. You guys know my address, brian@irishbreakdown.com. I enjoy these kind of debates, and that's the reason I did the podcast today was on this subject, because it's a fun subject. It's a fun topic. These are the kind of offseason debates I like to have. Who's the best quarterback of all time? Who's the top coaches? Who are the Heisman contenders? All this is the time of the year for that kind of stuff. So admire what Coach Kelly has done. He's locked himself into the top 5. No question about it. I just think we can debate on where he should be placed in that top 5. So you let me know where you think Coach Kelly should be. And if you read the article at irishbreakdown.com, I link the Bruce Feldman and the Stuart Mandel top 25s in there. Check them out. If you have a subscription, it's a paid subscription, so check them out. That's why I didn't kind of show them on here. I don't want to kind of give away the work that they're doing. But check out those lists. Let me know how other coaches that you agree with, don't agree with, who should be higher, who should be lower, those kind of things. So let us know in the comment section of our YouTube channel. Of course, you also really need to subscribe and hit the notification button too. We would love for you to check out all the content we put out. We're getting ready to record a podcast about the offensive line here really quick. So check that out. Make sure you are subscribing to our podcast wherever you listen to your podcast. And as always, check out irishbreakdown.com. So thanks for joining me today. And we will be back with you again very, very soon.